At Thanksgiving dinner, my daughter-in-law served everyone at the table except me. I just smiled and folded my hands in my lap. 3 weeks later, when a letter from my attorney was read aloud in front of the entire family, the color drained from her face. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. I've always believed Thanksgiving was about gratitude. Not the kind written on greeting cards or posted online for strangers to admire. Real gratitude. The kind you showed through your actions, through loyalty, through remembering who stood beside you when life was difficult. For most of my life, Thanksgiving was my favorite holiday. Christmas came with pressure. Birthdays came and went. But Thanksgiving was simple. Family, food, memories. At least, that's what it used to mean. I was 71 years old that November. The morning air carried the familiar chill of late autumn as I stood in my kitchen before sunrise. Golden leaves covered my backyard like a quilt stitched by nature itself. The coffee maker hummed softly while pumpkin bread cooled on the counter. For a moment, everything felt normal. For a moment, I could almost pretend Thomas was still alive. My husband had been gone for 3 years. 3 years. Some mornings it felt like yesterday. Other mornings it felt like another lifetime. I reached for the framed photograph that sat beside the window. Thomas smiled back at me from a beach vacation we'd taken nearly 20 years earlier. His arm was wrapped around my shoulders. My head rested against his chest. We looked happy, safe, like people who believed family would always stay family. "Happy Thanksgiving, Walter," I whispered. The house answered with silence. I stood there for another moment before setting the photograph back in its place. Then I got to work. I wasn't hosting Thanksgiving anymore. That tradition had changed after Gregory married Celeste. According to Celeste, her home was better suited for entertaining. Larger dining room, more modern kitchen, better location. At least that was what she told everyone. Still, I never arrived empty-handed. That morning I baked my famous pecan pie from scratch. The same recipe my mother had taught me more than 50 years earlier. I packed homemade cranberry sauce into glass containers. I wrapped small gifts for the grandchildren. Nothing expensive, just thoughtful things. A sketchbook for Harper, a football magazine for Nolan, 2 children's books for Tessa and Owen. Little traditions matter when you're the grandmother. Or at least they used to. By noon, my sedan was packed and ready. The drive to Gregory and Celeste's house took about 40 minutes. As I pulled into the neighborhood, I noticed rows of luxury homes decorated with wreaths and autumn displays. The neighborhood always made me feel slightly out of place. Not because I couldn't afford it, because I remembered helping pay for it. Years ago, when Gregory struggled to secure financing for the down payment, I'd quietly written a check. No speeches, no conditions. Just a mother helping her son. He promised he'd never forget. Funny how easily people forget things once they no longer need them. I pushed the thought aside. Thanksgiving wasn't the day for bitterness. At least that's what I told myself. The house buzzed with activity when I arrived. Children laughed upstairs. Football played on the television. The scent of turkey and cinnamon drifted through the air. For a brief moment, warmth settled in my chest. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe I'd imagined the distance growing between us. Maybe families simply changed as they grew older. Harper was the first to greet me. "Grandma!" She wrapped her arms around me tightly. Unlike many people in that house, her affection never felt forced. "There's my favorite granddaughter," I said. "You say that every year." "Because it's true every year," she laughed. For the first time that day, I felt genuinely happy. Then Celeste appeared. Her smile was perfect. Too perfect. The kind of smile people practice in mirrors. "Judith," she said. "You made it. Not Mom. Not even Judith's mother. Just Judith." As if I were a distant acquaintance who happened to stop by. "I wouldn't miss Thanksgiving," I replied. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the pie carrier in my hands. "Just leave that on the counter. No thank you. No compliment. No acknowledgement." I set the pie down and looked around the kitchen. Everyone seemed busy. Everyone except me. And for reasons I couldn't yet explain, I suddenly felt like a guest at my own family's celebration. A stranger standing just outside a circle she once belonged to. I didn't know it then. But before that dinner ended, Celeste would make one thing painfully clear. In her version of the family, there was a seat for everyone. Everyone except me. The dining room looked beautiful. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in. The long oak table was covered with a cream-colored tablecloth. Small pumpkins and candles decorated the center. Gold napkins had been folded carefully beside each plate. Through the large windows, I could see the last orange leaves clinging to the trees outside. Everything looked warm. Everything looked welcoming. And somehow, I had never felt more out of place. I carried my purse into the dining room and glanced around the table. Gregory was helping Nolan set out glasses. Tessa and Owen were arguing over which pie they wanted first. Harper was arranging place cards. For a few seconds, I simply stood there watching them. Families are strange. You can spend decades building one, loving one, sacrificing for one, and still suddenly feel like a visitor inside it. "Grandma, your seat is over here," Harper said. I smiled and followed her. My chair was at the far end of the table. Not unusual. At least that's what I told myself. Still, I couldn't help noticing that Gregory sat beside Celeste. The children sat together. Even distant relatives had been paired comfortably. I sat alone. Again. A small thing. The kind of thing people dismiss. But life has taught me that small things often reveal much bigger truths. I placed my napkin on my lap and looked around. Conversation flowed easily around me. People laughed. Stories were shared. Plans for Christmas were discussed. Several times I tried joining the conversation. Several times my words seemed to disappear into the air. Not ignored intentionally. At least not openly. Simply overlooked. Which somehow felt worse. I remembered Thanksgivings when Thomas was alive. He always noticed. If someone interrupted me, he'd bring the conversation back. If I was sitting quietly, he'd ask what I thought. He had a way of making sure I never felt invisible. The empty seat beside me felt heavier than usual that afternoon. I found myself missing him with an ache that never truly goes away. Grief changes over time. People say it gets easier. I don't think that's true. I think you simply learn how to carry it. The way you learn to walk with an old injury. The pain never leaves. You just become accustomed to it. A loud burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. Gregory had just finished telling a story from work. Everyone seemed entertained. Even Celeste laughed. Her hand rested possessively on his arm. I watched them for a moment. There had been a time when I genuinely liked Celeste. I remembered the day Gregory introduced her. She was charming, polite, ambitious. She brought flowers when she visited. She asked questions about family traditions. She seemed eager to belong. Looking back now, I often wonder whether any of it was real, or whether I simply saw what I wanted to see. The smell of roasted turkey drifted in from the kitchen. The children immediately became restless. "Owen, sit down. Tessa, stop touching that." 5 more minutes. The familiar chaos of family gatherings filled the room. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Then I noticed something strange. Everyone had a drink. Everyone except me. Again, it was a small thing. The others had iced tea, sparkling water, cider, or wine. My place sat empty. No glass, no drink, nothing. I told myself not to be sensitive. People forget things. People get busy. Thanksgiving dinners are hectic. I was 71 years old, not 13. I didn't need constant attention. Still, the feeling lingered. Like a pebble inside a shoe. Small, annoying, impossible to ignore. A few minutes later, Harper noticed. "Grandma doesn't have a drink." The room became quiet for half a second. Not long. Just enough. Celeste glanced toward me. "Oh," she smiled. That polished smile again. I must have forgotten. Forgotten. Such an innocent word. Gregory immediately looked uncomfortable. Not upset. Not surprised. Just uncomfortable. As if he wanted the moment to pass quickly. "I'll get one," he said. "No, that's okay," Celeste replied. "I've got it." She disappeared into the kitchen. A minute later she returned carrying a glass of water. Only water. Everyone else had something chosen specifically for them. I received a glass of tap water. I thanked her anyway. Because that's what women from my generation do. We thank people even when they're careless with our feelings. The meal began shortly afterward. Large serving dishes appeared one after another. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, green beans, cornbread. Everything looked wonderful. The children reached eagerly for food. Conversation grew louder. The room felt alive. Then something happened. Something so simple that another person might have dismissed it entirely. But I couldn't. Celeste began serving plates. She started with Gregory, then the children, then the relatives seated nearby, one by one, smiling, chatting, making sure everyone had exactly what they wanted. White meat or dark meat, extra stuffing, more gravy, a little cranberry sauce. Everyone was included. Everyone was noticed. I watched quietly from the end of the table, certain she would reach me next. She didn't. Instead, she moved past my chair, continued serving everyone else, never looking in my direction, never speaking to me, never asking what I wanted. At first I thought it was an accident, then another minute passed, then two. My plate remained empty. The rest of the family began eating. Forks scraped softly against china. People complimented the food. Children asked for seconds. And there I sat, the only person at the table without a meal. I looked toward Gregory. Surely he would notice. Surely he would say something. He glanced at me. Our eyes met. For one brief second, I saw recognition. He knew. Then he looked away. And that hurt more than anything Celeste could have done. I lowered my eyes to the empty plate in front of me. A strange calm settled over me. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something colder, something quieter. Because in that moment, surrounded by family, I finally understood something. What happened next wasn't going to be a misunderstanding. And deep down, I suspected this wasn't the first time Celeste had tried to push me out. It was simply the first time she had done it where everyone could see. I kept my smile in place. Years of teaching elementary school had taught me that sometimes dignity is simply refusing to react in front of an audience. So while everyone around me ate Thanksgiving dinner, I sat quietly with an empty plate. Eventually, Harper noticed. Again, Grandma doesn't have any food. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough. Several heads turned toward me. The room fell awkwardly silent. Celeste looked up from her seat. "Oh, goodness," she said with a small laugh. "I thought Judith said she wasn't hungry." I stared at her. I had said no such thing. For a moment, I waited for Gregory to correct her. To say, "No, Mom never said that." To say anything. Instead, he focused on cutting his turkey. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. "It's all right," I said softly. "I can serve myself." Nobody argued. Nobody insisted otherwise. I stood and walked toward the kitchen. The sounds of conversation slowly returned behind me, as though nothing unusual had happened. As though leaving one family member without a meal at Thanksgiving was perfectly normal. The kitchen felt strangely peaceful compared to the dining room. I stood alone beside the counter and looked down at the remaining food. For several seconds, I didn't move. I simply listened. The laughter, the conversations, the clinking of silverware, all coming from the next room, close enough to hear, far enough to feel excluded. The feeling wasn't new. That realization struck me harder than anything else. This wasn't the first time. It was only the first time I had stopped making excuses for it. As I filled my plate, memories began surfacing one after another. Small moments, tiny disappointments, things I had dismissed over the years, things that suddenly looked very different. 2 years earlier, Olivia's high school awards ceremony came to mind. I remembered sitting in the auditorium searching for my family. The event had already started when I arrived. My seat was near the back. Afterward, I learned everyone else had been sitting together near the front. Apparently, there had been a change in seating arrangements. Nobody had told me. Celeste apologized. She claimed she assumed Gregory had called. Gregory assumed Celeste had called. The mistake was never discussed again. At the time, I accepted the explanation. Now I wasn't so sure. Then there was Christmas. The previous year. I had spent days shopping for gifts. Wrapping paper covered my dining room table for nearly a week. I bought presents for everyone, including Celeste. When Christmas morning arrived, I watched family photos appear online. Matching pajamas, breakfast together, gift exchanges, laughter. I wasn't there. When I later asked Gregory about it, he looked surprised. "Didn't Celeste tell you we moved it to Christmas Eve morning?" No, she hadn't. Again, there was an apology. Again, there was an explanation. Again, I chose peace instead of questions. I carried my plate back toward the dining room. As I approached, I heard my name. I stopped. Not intentionally. The conversation simply reached me before I entered. "She worries too much," Celeste was saying. Her voice carried easily from the table. Someone chuckled. Then another voice asked, Is she still living alone? Of course, Celeste replied. I've been telling Gregory she should probably downsize. Downsize. The word immediately caught my attention. I remained just outside the doorway, not hiding, not eavesdropping, just standing still. That house is far too much for one person, Celeste continued. We're constantly worried about her. The concern in her voice sounded convincing. Very convincing. If I didn't know better, I might have believed it myself. One of the relatives nodded. That makes sense. I know, Celeste said. And honestly, she doesn't need all that space anymore. Something cold moved through my chest. Not because of what she said, because of how familiar it sounded. I had heard variations of that conversation before. Small comments, little suggestions, questions about the house, questions about my plans, questions about the future. At the time, they seemed harmless. Now they felt connected. Pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to solve. I entered the dining room. The conversation stopped immediately. Celeste smiled. That same perfect smile. Everything okay, Judith? There it was again. Judith. Never mom. Never anything warmer. Just Judith. The way you might address a coworker or a neighbor, not the woman who helped pay for the roof over your head. I sat down and nodded. Everything's fine. And for the first time all afternoon, I noticed something else. Olivia. She wasn't eating. She was watching. Watching her mother. Watching her father. Watching me. There was concern in her eyes. Real concern. The kind that couldn't be faked. When our eyes met, she looked away quickly. But not before I saw something else. Guilt. As though she knew something. As though she had witnessed things I hadn't. The realization stayed with me for the rest of dinner. The food tasted bland. The conversation felt distant. The room seemed colder. Because deep down I was beginning to understand that Thanksgiving wasn't the real problem. The empty plate wasn't the problem. Not even Celeste was the whole problem. The real problem was that this behavior had been happening for years. Quietly, patiently, one small exclusion at a time. And somehow, I had convinced myself it was all accidental. But as I looked around that table, one truth became impossible to ignore. Accidents don't repeat themselves for years. Patterns do. And for the first time, I was ready to see the pattern clearly. The rest of Thanksgiving dinner passed in a blur. People talked. Children laughed. Plates were emptied and refilled. Around me, life carried on, as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had changed inside me. Once you notice a crack in a wall, you can't stop seeing it. You start wondering how long it's been there, how deep it goes, whether the entire structure has been weakening for years. As everyone enjoyed dessert, I found myself drifting into memories. Not because I wanted to dwell on the past, because the past suddenly seemed full of answers. For most of Gregory's life, being his mother was the role I was proudest of. After Walter and I struggled for years to have children, Gregory felt like a miracle. I still remembered holding him in the hospital, his tiny hand wrapped around my finger, Walter standing beside me with tears in his eyes. We promised each other that day that our son would always know he was loved, and we kept that promise. At least we tried. There were years when money was tight, years when Walter worked 6 days a week, years when I took extra tutoring jobs after school. Not because we wanted luxuries, because we wanted opportunities for Gregory. His first baseball glove, his first car, his college tuition. Every sacrifice felt worthwhile. That's what parents do. We give, and give, and give, never expecting repayment, only hoping the love survives. I smiled faintly as I remembered Gregory at 12 years old. He had fallen off his bicycle and broken his wrist. The poor boy cried the entire drive to the emergency room. After the doctor finished, Gregory refused to let go of my hand. Even at 12, even surrounded by nurses, he trusted me completely. Back then, if someone had told him he would one day sit silently while his mother was humiliated, he would have called them crazy. Life changes people, sometimes gradually, sometimes without them realizing it. I looked across the dining room. Gregory was laughing at something one of the relatives had said. He looked happy, comfortable, untroubled, and for a moment, I wondered whether he remembered any of those sacrifices at all. Then I immediately felt guilty, because motherhood has a strange way of defending people even when they disappoint us. Part of me still wanted to protect him, to believe none of this was intentional, to believe he was simply caught between his wife and his mother. But another part of me was getting tired. tired of making excuses, tired of pretending I didn't see what was right in front of me. As dessert was served, another memory surfaced. The house. My house. The same house where Walter and I had lived for over 40 years. The same house where Gregory grew up. The same house where every birthday, Christmas, and family celebration had once taken place. 3 years earlier, shortly after Walter passed away, Gregory had come over one Saturday afternoon. He seemed nervous, almost rehearsed. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee. After several minutes of small talk, he cleared his throat. "Mom, have you ever thought about moving?" The question surprised me. At the time, I assumed he was worried about me, a widow living alone, a large property to maintain. It seemed reasonable. "Not really," I told him. "This is home." He nodded, but there was disappointment in his expression. Subtle, easy to miss. A few weeks later, Celeste brought up the same subject. Then a few months later, again and again. Always presented as concern. Always wrapped in kindness. "You'd have less stress. You deserve something smaller. Imagine how much easier life would be." At first, I appreciated their concern. Now, sitting at that Thanksgiving table, I wondered if concern had ever been the real motivation. Because the house wasn't just a house. It sat on nearly 4 acres of valuable land. Property values in the area had risen dramatically over the years. Developers had made offers more than once. Walter always refused. "This land stays in the family," he would say. I remembered those words clearly. And suddenly, I found myself wondering whether Celeste remembered them too, or whether she saw something entirely different when she looked at my property. Not memories, not history, not family, just numbers, just value, just opportunity. The thought unsettled me, perhaps because it explained too much. When people see you as a person, they make room for you. When people see you as an obstacle, they slowly push you aside, one small step at a time, one forgotten invitation, one changed holiday plan, one empty plate. I glanced toward Olivia again. She had barely spoken throughout dinner. Several times I caught her looking in my direction. Each time she quickly looked away. The poor girl appeared conflicted, as though she were carrying a secret she wasn't sure she should reveal. That feeling stayed with me. Long after dessert ended. Long after coffee was served. Long after relatives began gathering coats and leftovers. By the time the evening started winding down, I knew 2 things. First, what happened at dinner had not been an accident. Not anymore. Not after everything I had remembered. Not after years of similar moments. And second, Olivia knew something. I didn't know what. I didn't know how serious it was, but I could feel it. The same way you can feel a storm approaching before the first drop of rain falls. As I gathered my purse near the front door, Olivia suddenly appeared beside me. "Grandma?" Her voice was quiet, nervous. I turned toward her. She glanced over her shoulder to make sure nobody was listening. Then she looked back at me. For a moment, it seemed like she wanted to say something. Something important. Something she'd been holding in for a long time. But before she could speak, Celeste called from across the room. "Olivia, we're leaving." The moment vanished instantly. Olivia hesitated, then forced a smile. "I'll call you soon, Grandma." I nodded, but as I walked toward my car that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the look in her eyes. Because it wasn't pity. It wasn't embarrassment. It was the look of someone who knew the truth. And I had a feeling that truth was about to change everything. The drive home felt longer than usual. The roads were nearly empty. Most families were still gathered around dining tables, sharing pie, watching football, or arguing over board games. The warm yellow lights glowing through living room windows reminded me of Thanksgivings from years ago, back when Walter was alive, back when family gatherings felt effortless, back when I never questioned whether I belonged. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the temperature had dropped considerably. Cold air greeted me as I stepped out of the car. The old maple tree in the front yard swayed gently in the evening wind. For a moment, I stood there looking at my house, my home. 43 years of memories lived inside those walls. Gregory's first steps, family Christmas mornings, graduation celebrations, Walter's retirement party, the last birthday we celebrated before his heart gave out. I suddenly understood why the conversation about downsizing bothered me so much. People thought they were talking about property. I was hearing them talk about my life. Inside, I hung up my coat and turned on the kitchen light. The silence wrapped around me immediately. After a busy family gathering, an empty house always felt larger, lonelier. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Walter and I used to drink coffee every morning, the same table where we'd spend hours talking after Gregory moved out, the same table where, more than once, Walter had warned me about something I never wanted to believe. I remembered one conversation clearly. It happened about a year before he passed away. We were reviewing paperwork, insurance policies, retirement accounts, property documents. None of it was exciting. But Walter insisted on keeping everything organized. Just in case, he always said. That afternoon he looked up from the papers and surprised me. If anything ever happens to me, don't let anyone pressure you into making quick decisions. I laughed. Who would pressure me? He hesitated, then shrugged. People change when money enters the conversation. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Walter always planned for worst-case scenarios. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen, I wondered if he had noticed things long before I did. Maybe he had seen signs. Maybe he had simply understood human nature better than I wanted to. My thoughts were interrupted by my phone vibrating on the table. The screen lit up. Olivia. For a second, I simply stared at her name. Then I answered. Hi, sweetheart. Grandma, are you busy? Something in her voice immediately caught my attention. She sounded nervous. Very nervous. No, I said gently. What's wrong? There was a pause. Several seconds passed. I could hear her breathing. Then she finally spoke. I wanted to make sure you got home okay. The answer sounded rehearsed, polite, safe. Not the real reason she called. I'm home, I replied. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Olivia lowered her voice. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course. Did today upset you? I looked down at my untouched tea. Steam curled slowly upward from the cup. Part of me wanted to protect her, to tell her everything was fine, to continue pretending. But I was tired of pretending. A little, I admitted. The relief in her voice was immediate. Okay? Just one word. But it told me everything. She had seen it too. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she whispered something that made my stomach tighten. I knew it wasn't just me. My grip tightened around the phone. What do you mean? Another pause. I could almost picture her sitting in her bedroom, debating how much to say. Finally she exhaled. Grandma, Mom talks about you a lot when you're not around. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. I remained silent, letting her continue. Not to your face. Never when other people are around. But she says things. What kind of things? I asked quietly. Olivia hesitated, then answered. She says you're stuck in the past. I nodded slowly. That wasn't pleasant. But it wasn't shocking either. Olivia continued. She says the family would be better off if you finally moved. There it was again. Moved. Always moved. Never visited more. Never included more. Never loved more. Just moved. As though my existence had become a logistical problem. I felt a familiar ache settle in my chest. Not anger. Disappointment. The kind that arrives when a suspicion becomes a fact. Is that all? I asked. Olivia didn't answer immediately, and that silence worried me more than anything she'd said so far, because it sounded like someone deciding whether to cross a line they couldn't uncross. Finally she spoke. No. The word came out barely above a whisper. No, Grandma. I sat very still, listening, waiting. About 2 months ago, I heard Mom and Dad talking. My heartbeat slowed. Every instinct told me to pay attention. They didn't know I was upstairs. What were they talking about? Olivia swallowed audibly. The house. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the wind rattled a branch against the window. Inside, the kitchen seemed impossibly quiet. The house? I repeated. Yes. What about it? Olivia's voice dropped even lower. I heard Mom say that once you leave, everything will finally fall into place. A chill ran through me. Not because of the words themselves, because of how certain they sounded. Not if. Not maybe. Once. As though my departure wasn't a possibility. It was part of a plan already underway. I stared into the darkness beyond the kitchen window. Suddenly, Thanksgiving dinner looked very different. The empty plate, the forgotten drink, the years of exclusion, the endless conversations about downsizing. For the first time, they no longer seemed like isolated incidents. They felt connected, purposeful, deliberate, and deep down, I had a feeling Olivia had only told me the beginning. The real truth was still waiting, and whatever that truth was, it explained why Celeste had spent years trying to make me feel like a stranger in my own family. After I hung up with Olivia, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The tea had gone cold. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. Outside, the wind pushed dried leaves across the driveway. Inside, my thoughts refused to settle. I kept hearing the same sentence over and over. Once you leave, everything will finally fall into place. Not if, not someday, not maybe. Once. The confidence behind those words disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. People don't speak that way unless they believe something is already happening. Unless they believe the outcome is inevitable. For years, I had viewed Celeste's behavior as unpleasant but harmless. Controlling, perhaps. Disrespectful at times. But harmless. Now I wasn't so sure. I finally stood and walked toward Walter's old study. Very little had changed since his death. His leather chair still sat beside the window. His bookshelf remained exactly as he'd left it. Even the brass desk lamp still occupied the same corner of his desk. Sometimes people ask why widows keep things the same. The answer is simple. Certain objects become anchors. They remind you that your life actually happened, that the people you loved were real. I opened the desk drawer where Walter kept important documents, insurance records, property deeds, tax files, trust paperwork. The folders were neatly labeled in his handwriting. Seeing his handwriting always affected me, even after 3 years. I ran my fingers across one of the folders. Then I stopped. A memory surfaced. About 6 months before Walter passed away, he had asked me to attend a meeting with our attorney. At the time, I barely paid attention. The discussion revolved around estate planning, legal language, future contingencies, things that seemed very far away. I remembered becoming bored halfway through. Walter noticed. Afterward, he laughed and said, "One day you'll be glad I made you sit through that." At the time, I rolled my eyes. Now I wondered if that day had arrived. I carried several folders back to the kitchen table. For the next hour, I read, slowly, carefully. Much of it was familiar. Some of it wasn't. And the more I read, the more questions began forming. One detail stood out immediately. The property. My property. The house and surrounding acreage had been placed inside a carefully structured family trust years earlier. Walter had designed it that way specifically to prevent outside pressure or impulsive decisions after his death. I remembered him saying that. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now his caution looked more like wisdom. Around midnight, my phone vibrated again. A text message. From Carol Bennett, my oldest friend. "Happy Thanksgiving, Judith. Hope you survived the family circus." Despite everything, I laughed. Carol had never been known for subtlety. A few seconds later, another message appeared. "You okay?" I stared at the screen. Then I typed back. "Not really." The response came almost immediately. "Coffee tomorrow morning. My place. 9 a.m. No questions. No explanations." That was Carol. 46 years of friendship creates a language of its own. The next morning, I arrived at her house carrying a box of leftover pie. Carol opened the door before I even knocked. One look at my face and she said, "It's worse than I thought." I followed her into the kitchen. The smell of coffee filled the room. Her golden retriever lifted his head briefly before returning to sleep. Everything felt comfortable. Safe. The way true friendships often do. For the first 15 minutes, I told her everything. Thanksgiving dinner. The empty plate. Olivia's phone call. The comments about moving. The conversation about the house. Carol listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Her expression was thoughtful. Not surprised. Thoughtful. That bothered me. "You don't look shocked." "I'm not." The answer came too quickly. I stared at her. "What does that mean?" Carol sighed. Then she wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "Judith, can I be honest? Please. I think this has been building for years." The words landed harder than I expected, because they echoed my own thoughts. "I know," I admitted quietly. "No, I mean longer than you realize." I frowned. Carol hesitated, then continued. "About a year ago, I ran into Celeste at a charity luncheon. My attention sharpened immediately. She didn't know I was standing behind her. A familiar feeling settled in my stomach, the same feeling I'd experienced while listening to Olivia. Carol looked uncomfortable. She was talking with 2 women from her neighborhood. What did she say? Carol sighed, then repeated the words exactly. That property is just sitting there waiting to be used properly. I felt my chest tighten. Neither of us spoke. Carol continued. Once everything is eventually ours, Gregory and I have plans. Eventually ours. Not Gregory's. Not mine. Ours. The words felt deliberate. Possessive. Calculated. I looked out the kitchen window. Snow clouds were beginning to gather in the distance. Winter was arriving early that year. What kind of plans? I asked. I don't know. Carol shook her head. But I remember finding the conversation strange. She paused, then added quietly, because she wasn't talking about your home like it belonged to family. I already knew what she was about to say. Still, hearing it hurt. She talked about it like an investment. The room fell silent. For years, I had been looking at my family through the lens of love. Love makes people overlook things, excuse things, forgive things. But when I removed that lens, the picture became clearer, and not prettier. Suddenly, Olivia's warning didn't sound like teenage exaggeration. It sounded like confirmation. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The pressure to move, the constant exclusions, the subtle disrespect, the conversations about the property. None of it felt random anymore. For the first time, I began wondering whether Thanksgiving dinner had been more than humiliation. Maybe it had been a test, a way to see how much disrespect I would tolerate, how far they could push me, how invisible they could make me feel. If that was true, they had made one critical mistake. Because instead of breaking me, they had finally forced me to pay attention. And once I started paying attention, I wasn't sure they were going to like what happened next. The following week, I stopped asking questions. Not because I had lost interest, because I had finally learned something important. People reveal far more when they believe you aren't paying attention. For years, I had defended Celeste. When friends hinted that something felt off, I changed the subject. When small exclusions happened, I explained them away. When Gregory became distant, I blamed work, stress, life, anything except what was right in front of me. Now I was done explaining things for other people. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the truth. And truth requires patience. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. The first hints of winter had settled over town. I followed my normal routine: coffee, the newspaper, a walk through the backyard. Anyone watching would have thought nothing had changed. That was exactly what I wanted. A few days after Thanksgiving, Gregory called. The call surprised me. Lately, most communication came through group texts or holiday invitations. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Hello, sweetheart." We exchanged small talk for several minutes. Weather, football, the grandchildren. Then he casually brought up the subject. The house. Again. I wasn't surprised. "What are your plans for the property long term?" he asked. I looked out the kitchen window. The maple tree stood bare now. Winter had stripped away all its leaves. Funny how nature sometimes mirrors life. "I'm not sure," I replied. "Why do you ask?" There was a brief pause. Not long, just enough. No reason. Just thinking ahead. Thinking ahead, the same phrase people use when they're already making plans. I kept my voice calm. "That's kind of you." The conversation continued for another minute before ending. After I hung up, I wrote down everything I remembered. Every question, every comment, every detail. Not because I was building a case, because I wanted facts instead of feelings. Facts are harder to ignore. 3 days later, Olivia called again. This time she sounded more relaxed, as though making the first call had lifted some weight from her shoulders. We talked about school, her classes, her plans for college. For a while, she sounded like any 18-year-old preparing for adulthood. Then her tone changed. "Grandma? Yes? I need to tell you something else." I remained silent, letting her continue. I heard another conversation. My stomach tightened. "When?" "Last weekend." I leaned back in my chair. Outside, light snow drifted across the yard. The world looked peaceful. My family felt anything but peaceful. "What did you hear?" Olivia hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Mom was talking to Dad about renovating your house." I frowned. "Renovating my house?" "Yes." The words sounded ridiculous. No one had discussed renovations with me. No one had even asked. Yet apparently, plans already existed. What exactly did she say? Olivia exhaled slowly. I remember because it sounded strange. Another pause. Then she repeated the words. Once we get control of it, we'll finally be able to do things properly. I closed my eyes. Control. Not inherit, not help manage. Control. The language mattered. People reveal themselves through the words they choose. And those words didn't sound like family. They sounded like ownership. The conversation continued for several more minutes. By the time we hung up, a pattern had become impossible to deny. The house appeared in every conversation, every future plan, every discussion. Always the house, always what came afterward. Never me, never what I wanted, never what Walter had wanted. Just the property, just the value, just the opportunity. That evening, I pulled out old photo albums. I hadn't looked through them in months, maybe years. Page after page documented a life. Walter building a treehouse for Gregory, family camping trips, Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, graduation ceremonies, ordinary moments that had once seemed permanent. One photograph stopped me. Gregory was about 10 years old. We were standing in front of the house, the same house everyone seemed so interested in now. His arm wrapped around my waist, a huge grin on his face. Written on the back in Walter's handwriting were 4 simple words. Home is the people. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Home is the people, not the land, not the value, not the square footage. The people. Somewhere along the way, certain members of my family had forgotten that. The realization hurt. But it also brought clarity. For the first time, I stopped worrying about whether I was imagining things. I wasn't. Too many pieces fit together. Too many conversations pointed in the same direction. Too many people had independently confirmed what I'd been sensing for years. Later that week, I made an appointment with Samuel Harper, Walter's attorney, the man who had helped structure our trust years ago. I didn't tell Gregory. I didn't tell Olivia. I didn't tell anyone except Carol. Some conversations are better held quietly. The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. As I wrote the date on my calendar, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not fear. Relief. For weeks, I had been collecting fragments of information, questions without answers. Now I was finally moving toward facts. Real facts. The kind that could either confirm my suspicions or prove me wrong. And honestly, I hoped I was wrong. I hoped there was some innocent explanation. I hoped everyone else had misunderstood. I hoped my family was still my family. But deep down, I no longer believed that was what Samuel was going to tell me. Because every road seemed to lead back to the same place. The house. The trust. And whatever plans Celeste had been making behind closed doors. By Tuesday afternoon, I would discover just how much had been happening without my knowledge. And the truth was bigger than I expected. Tuesday arrived with freezing rain, the kind that coated roads in a thin layer of ice, and turned the entire town gray. I left home earlier than necessary, partly because I wanted extra time, mostly because I wasn't sure I was ready for what I might learn. Samuel Harper's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building downtown. Walter had trusted Samuel for more than 25 years, and Walter trusted very few people completely. When I stepped inside, the receptionist greeted me warmly. A few minutes later, Samuel appeared in the doorway. Judith. He smiled and shook my hand. It's been too long. Far too long. He led me into his office. Everything looked exactly as I remembered. The same dark wood shelves, the same framed certificates, the same photographs of fishing trips Samuel and Walter had taken together decades ago. For a moment, seeing Walter's face in one of those photos nearly brought tears to my eyes. Samuel noticed. He was a good man. I nodded quietly. Yes, he was. After we sat down, the conversation began with small talk, but neither of us had come for small talk. Eventually, Samuel folded his hands together. What can I help you with? I took a deep breath. Then, I told him everything. Thanksgiving. The empty plate. The conversations Olivia overheard. The comments Carol remembered. The repeated pressure to move. The constant discussions about my property. Samuel listened carefully, never interrupting, never rushing me. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. His expression had changed. The warmth remained, but now there was concern. Judith, he said carefully, have Gregory or Celeste ever asked you to sign anything? The question surprised me. A few things. What kind of things? I thought for a moment, then remembered. Last spring, Celeste brought over several forms. Samuel immediately looked interested. What forms? She said they were related to emergency planning. I frowned. I never signed them. His eyes narrowed slightly. Why not? I almost laughed. Because Walter spent 40 years teaching me never to sign documents I haven't read. For the first time that morning, Samuel smiled. Good. The single word carried more weight than I expected. Very good. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. What were those documents? Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. I can't know for certain without seeing them. Then he added, but there are several legal mechanisms people sometimes use when discussing future care, property management, or financial authority. I stared at him, suddenly remembering details I'd ignored. Celeste had seemed unusually disappointed when I refused. At the time, I thought she was simply frustrated. Now I wasn't so sure. Samuel opened a folder, then another. For nearly 30 minutes we reviewed trust documents and estate records. Much of the legal language was complicated, but the overall message was surprisingly simple. Walter had protected me. Extensively. More extensively than I realized. The house couldn't simply be transferred. The trust couldn't simply be altered. Major decisions required specific legal processes. No shortcuts existed. No easy path around them. When Samuel finished explaining everything, I felt relief. For about 5 seconds. Then he said something that changed everything. There is one thing you should know. My heart immediately tightened. What? Samuel reached for another file. This one looked newer, recently updated. He opened it carefully. About 8 months ago, Gregory contacted my office. I blinked. Gregory? Yes. I felt cold. What did he want? Samuel hesitated. Not because he didn't want to answer, because he understood the answer might hurt. He requested information about the trust. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I stared at him, trying to process what I'd heard. Information? He wanted to understand how future ownership would work. Ownership. There was that word again. Always the future. Always afterward. Never the present. Never me. What exactly did he ask? Samuel looked down at his notes, then answered. He asked whether property held in trust could be liquidated after inheritance. Liquidated. Not preserved. Not maintained. Liquidated. Sold. The word landed like a stone in my chest. I looked toward the window. Snow drifted slowly past the glass. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. Did he mention why? Samuel nodded, then sighed. He said he was exploring future possibilities. Future possibilities. The same language. The same pattern. The same focus. The house. The land. The value. I suddenly remembered something Olivia had said. Once we get control of it. Not if. Once. The confidence made sense now. Too much sense. Samuel closed the file. Judith, I want to be careful here. I nodded. But based on everything you've told me, I think you should review your estate plan. I already knew what he meant, not because he said it directly. Because Walter would have said exactly the same thing. Protect yourself. Pay attention. Don't ignore what people are showing you. For years, I had assumed my family loved me the same way I loved them. Maybe that was my mistake. Love gives. Love protects. Love includes. What I experienced at Thanksgiving felt very different. Before leaving, I scheduled another meeting. A longer one. Samuel wanted time to prepare recommendations. I agreed. As I stood to leave, he handed me a copy of several trust documents. Take these home. I accepted the folder, then paused. Samuel? Yes. If Walter were sitting here right now, what do you think he'd tell me? The attorney smiled sadly. For a moment, he looked less like a lawyer and more like an old friend remembering someone he missed. Then he answered. He'd tell you to stop doubting yourself. The drive home felt different from the drive there. Heavier, but clearer. Because for the first time, my suspicions were no longer based on feelings alone. There were facts now. Questions Gregory had asked. Documents Celeste wanted signed. Conversations about future ownership. Plans being made behind closed doors. And as I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, one thing became painfully clear. Thanksgiving dinner had never been about an empty plate. The empty plate was a message, a warning, a way of showing me exactly where Celeste believed I belonged. What she didn't realize was that her little performance had accomplished the opposite of what she intended. Instead of making me feel powerless, it had forced me to wake up. And very soon, the entire family was going to learn that Judith Langford had been paying much closer attention than they realized. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, I invited the family to my house, not for Christmas, not for a birthday, just a family dinner, the kind of gathering Walter and I used to host all the time. The invitation surprised everyone, especially Gregory, especially Celeste. I could hear it in their voices when they called. "You want all of us to come?" Gregory asked. "Of course. Is everything okay?" I smiled to myself. Everything is perfectly fine. And for the first time in a very long time, that was actually true. The weeks between Thanksgiving and that dinner had changed me. Not because I discovered anything shocking, because I finally stopped ignoring what had been right in front of me for years. Samuel and I met twice more. Together, we reviewed every document, every trust provision, every estate plan, every protection Walter had carefully put in place. We made a few updates, nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just thoughtful decisions made by a woman who finally understood the difference between love and obligation. Walter had spent decades building security for our family. My responsibility was protecting it, not surrendering it, not apologizing for it, protecting it. The evening of the dinner arrived cold and clear. Snow covered parts of the yard. Lights glowed warmly through the windows. For the first time in years, my house felt alive again. The smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen. Music played softly in the background. Family photographs lined the walls. Walter seemed present everywhere. Not physically, but in memory, in spirit, in the life we had built together. One by one, everyone arrived. Gregory, Celeste, Olivia, Nolan, the younger children, even a few relatives. I greeted each person warmly. No bitterness, no hostility, no drama. That seemed to confuse Celeste more than anything. Several times during the evening, I caught her studying me, as though she couldn't understand why I appeared so calm. The answer was simple, because I no longer needed anyone's approval. Dinner passed pleasantly, conversation flowed, the grandchildren laughed, stories were shared. For the first time in months, I simply observed, and what I saw surprised me. Olivia looked relaxed. Nolan seemed happy. The younger children played near the fireplace. Even Gregory appeared less tense than usual. The only uncomfortable person in the room was Celeste. Eventually, after dessert, I stood. The room gradually became quiet. Not because I demanded attention, because everyone sensed I wanted to say something. I picked up a small framed photograph from the side table. Walter's favorite picture. The one taken in front of the house nearly 20 years earlier. Gregory stood beside us. A boy with a huge smile. A family that believed the future would always be simple. I looked around the room. Then I spoke. "You know, your father loved this house." Gregory nodded. "I know. He used to say that a home isn't measured by property lines." I smiled softly. He said a home is measured by the people who gather inside it. Silence filled the room. A good silence. The kind that allows truth to settle. I continued. "For a long time, I worried about what would happen to this house one day." I saw Celeste sit a little straighter, almost imperceptibly. But I noticed. These days, I notice everything. Then I realized I was asking the wrong question. I looked toward the grandchildren, toward Olivia, toward the family. The real question isn't who gets a house. It's whether we've treated each other in a way that deserves a family. Nobody spoke, not even Celeste. I set the photograph back down. Then I smiled, a genuine smile, the kind that comes from peace, not victory, peace. There have been some changes to my estate planning. That got their attention, especially Gregory, especially Celeste. But those decisions are private. The room remained silent. No one is entitled to know the details. I said it gently, without anger, without accusation. Just a fact, a boundary, something I should have established years earlier. I looked directly at Gregory. "I love you." His eyes immediately softened. "And I always will." His expression changed. For the first time all evening, I saw shame there, real shame, not because of money, not because of property, because somewhere deep down, he finally understood what had been lost. Then I looked toward Celeste. She seemed uncertain, perhaps waiting for a confrontation, perhaps expecting an attack. She received neither. Instead, I simply said, "I hope all of us remember that kindness matters. Nothing more, nothing less, because the truth no longer required a fight. Everyone already knew it." The rest of the evening passed quietly. People gathered coats. Children hugged goodbye. Cars disappeared down the snowy street. Eventually, only Olivia remained. She wrapped her arms around me before leaving. "I love you, Grandma. I love you too." She hesitated, then smiled. A real smile. The kind I'd been missing for a long time. After she left, I locked the front door and stood alone in the hallway. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now. Not lonely, peaceful. I walked into the living room and sat beside Walter's photograph. Outside, snow drifted gently beneath the streetlights. Inside, everything felt still. For years, I believed my greatest fear was losing my family. Thanksgiving taught me something different. The real danger wasn't losing people. It was losing myself while trying to keep them happy. The empty plate at Thanksgiving had hurt. The silence had hurt. The exclusion had hurt. But in a strange way, I was grateful for it now. Because that moment forced me to see the truth. Not the truth about money. Not the truth about property. The truth about people. Some people love you for who you are. Others love what you can provide. Learning the difference is painful, but necessary. I glanced once more at Walter's photograph, then at the warm room around me, the home we had built, the life we had shared. And finally, after all those years, I felt something I hadn't felt since losing him. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, not because everyone changed, but because I finally remembered my own worth. And that, more than any inheritance, was the greatest thing Walter ever left behind. If there's one thing I learned from that Thanksgiving, it's that respect cannot survive where gratitude no longer exists. For years, I kept making excuses for people because I loved them. But love should never require you to ignore your own worth. Family isn't defined by who shares your last name or who expects an inheritance. It's defined by who treats you with kindness when they have nothing to gain. And sometimes, the most important thing a woman can do is stop shrinking herself to keep others comfortable and remember the value she already has. After all, a home is never built on property or money. It is built on dignity. And dignity is something no one can take from you unless you give it away.